Participants flew in from all over the world to take part. 572 parachutists took to the skies, breaking the old record of 515 skydivers jumping at one time. The event was part of a special birthday present for the King of Thailand, who turned 72 on Sunday. And now over to Farland Chang, who's also flying high because it's Friday. Farland.
Oh, you got that right. Thanks very much, Karuna. In this half hour of Asia Business Morning, Wall Street reaches higher as inflation fears continue to recede. The markets get a lift from the soothing words of one of America's central bankers. The world's trade negotiators move closer to a deal on the farm sector as protesters continue to stock the streets of Seattle. And it's an open secret, the temptation growing as we get closer to the holidays. We'll tell you what many people are doing on their work computers but won't admit to in public. That's today's Time Out feature. Asia Business Morning is next. Good morning and welcome to Asia Business Morning this Friday. I'm Farland Chang. Wall Street continues to move ahead as inflation fears calm. It now looks like another Fed rate hike is some ways off. We go to Tony Guida in New York for the details. Hello, Tony. Looks like the bulls are still in control.
Especially in the tech market. Farland, good morning. Stocks rallied for the second straight day on Wall Street. This time, technology shares led the way. Bullish comments on inflation from Federal Reserve Governor also gave the market a boost. The Dow Industrials gained 40 points. They closed at 11,039. Hewlett-Packard and Alcoa each gained more than $3 a share. The NASDAQ composite, meantime, posted its fourth biggest point gain ever. It rose 99 points to 34.52. That is yet another record for the NASDAQ. Yahoo jumped another $16, close to $17 actually. The internet portal has gained over $30 in the past 2 days. The S&P 500 was up 11. In the U.S. credit market, the 30-year Treasury issue is down 12/30 seconds in price. The yield now 6.31%. New home sales jumped more than 16% in October. That's the biggest increase in 6 years. That despite rising mortgage rates. The average cost of a new home in the United States rose to nearly $199,000. Exxon and Mobil have agreed to sell more than 1,700 gas service stations along the northeast corridor to Tosco. Tosco is an oil refiner based in Connecticut. It owns Circle K, the second largest convenience store chain in the United States. Earlier this week, federal regulators approved the Exxon-Mobil merger on the condition that the new company sell 2,400 stations. That's a look at business news from New York. I'm Tony Guida. Let's get back to Farland in Hong Kong.
No, thanks very much for that report, Tony. Meanwhile, in Seattle, protests continue, but trade officials are inching their way toward a deal on world farm trade. That's one of the most contentious issues on the agenda. An agreement could be reached as early as Friday, though talks may yet drag on until Saturday. Front and center is Europe's massive farm support and export subsidy programs, which the U.S. and other nations, such as Australia, want to see cut back. Another bone of contention, how to deal with genetically engineered foods. That's a hot-button issue for the U.S., where half of all soybeans and 1/3 of all corn is genetically engineered. Also taking place on the sidelines of the World Trade talks, an international convention banning child labor. U.S. President Bill Clinton, who signed the accord before leaving Seattle, hailed the treaty as proof that labor issues can be included in the trade agenda.
Some say that it is not possible, that the interests of nations, businesses, and labor within and across national borders are too divergent. This child labor convention proves that, at least on this profoundly important issue, it is possible. It is a living example of how we can together come to level up global standards and lift up core labor values.
Back now to the overnight action on Wall Street. Will the rally continue tomorrow? That'll likely depend on tomorrow's employment report. For a preview, we've got Michael Clarity, market strategist for Credit Suisse First Boston. Michael, thanks very much for joining us. Tell us what you're expecting tomorrow.
Well, I think it's going to be a fairly strong report once again. We're looking for 190,000 gain in payrolls, for a unemployment rate to remain at 4.1, and for a 0.4 gain in hourly earnings. I think the market's going to be focused a little bit more on the unemployment rate and the earnings side than the payroll figure. For one reason, there's some concern that the low payroll figure might be more reflective of a lack of supply of workers rather than a lack of demand.
With this strong report, what's your expectation on the Fed acting on the rates?
Well, I think it's not so much an issue for 1999. The next meeting is shortly before the end of the year. I think that Y2K concerns are enough to keep them out of the market, even if we do get strong economic data. But for the first quarter of next year, I think that we could see a 25 basis point rate hike and a total of 50 basis points worth of rate hikes in 2000.
What's your advice for investors then?
Well, I think given that, you know, there's still a lot of concern in the bond market. Doesn't look extremely attractive right now. Corporate bonds still look more attractive. We could see spread tightening. So corporate bonds, mortgages, things like that. And still, while treasuries have sold off a lot, yields are still not back to levels that are good alternatives for the stock market for individual investors.
Good to get your outlook. Michael Clarity, market strategist, Credit Suisse First Boston.
Thanks.
Indonesia's scandal-plagued Bank Bali returns to the markets. After a nearly 4-month suspension, Bank Bali shares will begin trading again on the Jakarta Bourse today, and the bank says it is planning a massive 99-for-1 rights issue, hoping to raise $560 million. The proceeds will be used to recapitalize the ailing bank. Standard Chartered, which is taking a 20% stake in the bank, says it will take up its allotment of new shares. In Malaysia, another sign of the changing balance of power. The new Islamic fundamentalist government in Malaysia's Terengganu state wants a bigger slice of the pie. It is pressing for higher oil and gas royalties from the federal government. Terengganu produces 60% of the country's oil, and the fundamentalists say it is time local people get their due. The latest demand could further dampen overall market sentiment. Shares in gaming and brewery firms lost more ground yesterday on remarks that Terengganu would ban gambling and sales of liquor to Muslims. But the key stock index finished flat. Investors waiting for the appointment of a new cabinet by Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad next week. Well, it's been a year in coming, but the euro has finally hit parity with the U.S. dollar. Now what? We'll tell you the latest buzz in the currency markets in just a moment. First, a look at how the dollar is trading in Asia at this hour.
Deloitte Consulting is proud to be associated with this program. Deloitte Consulting.
Northern Ireland topping our world headlines. Karun is here with that.
That is right, Farland. In Northern Ireland, peace is topping the headlines instead of violence. For the first time in history, Irish Republican Army supporters sat down with their longtime Protestant foes in a new power-sharing government. The British government had controlled the region for 27 years. The long road to self-rule has been filled with violence and terrorism, but the new government got off to a peaceful start. An apartment building has collapsed in Austria, and at least 30 people are feared trapped in the rubble. The 3-story building was destroyed in an apparent natural gas explosion in the town of Wilhelmsburg, west of Vienna. Soldiers are helping rescue workers search the rubble for survivors. Emergency service workers in Australia. And those are the world headlines. Back to you, Farland.
Thanks very much, Karuna. The euro is finally on equal terms with the dollar after months of teetering on the brink of parity. The single currency has fallen below that psychological barrier. Not even late encouraging noises from the European Central Bank President Wim Duisenberg could halt the slide. Fears are that the fledgling currency could now go into a free fall.
The European single currency was launched with much fanfare. Over the past year, the euro's received a distinctly cooler reception by the markets. Its relentless plunge now sees it at parity with the US dollar. Currency valuations often depend as much on psychological factors as economic fundamentals, and the euro's backers have failed to win over the minds of traders.
The ECB, for example, and European finance ministers still very much have a selling job to do, and that's why Wim Duisenberg, the ECB president, for example, said
Christian Mayner, CNN Financial News, London.
To take a closer look at what is next for the euro, we have Joanne Masters on the line. She's a currency strategist at Macquarie Bank in Sydney. Thanks very much for joining us, Joanne. Now, give us a quick update of what the euro is doing right now.
Well, we've bounced back off that parity level. We're about 1.002 now, and we have been for some time. In fact, we only traded below the parity level for about 10 minutes or so on the back of some offshore selling. Seems today that it's going to be hard to test in Sydney time that parity level again. Euro seems to have stabilised around this 1.002 level, but we do think there's a possibility of testing parity again when London trading comes on this afternoon.
Where do you expect it's going to go from here? How great is this risk that it'll go into a free fall against the dollar?
Well, it is possible. Market sentiment against the euro is quite negative on the back of some disappointment about growth and also some concern about the German government involvement in the Holzmann rescue. However, I think at this point the euro is oversold. It's too weak, and fundamentals suggest that it should be a little bit stronger than this. Whether we can get stronger before the end of this year is difficult given Y2K concerns, but I'm still fairly optimistic for the euro through 2000.
You know, the currency's only a year old, and already it's lost some 15% or so since its launch. How much of a setback is this to the euro's credibility?
Well, there is increasingly some question about the credibility, but ultimately it's partly a story of the strong and very successful story of the US economy. As I said, looking forward, if we do see a rebound in the euro in 2000, then I don't think there's too much damage for credibility. However, if we do get a free fall, then I think the ECB will become increasingly concerned.
Briefly, how do you see this affecting the world economy, in particular Asian economies?
Well, the key issue here is that a weaker currency should actually support growth in Europe, and particularly in Germany, and they should see stronger exports. Asia is an important export base for the European economies, so if anything, it should be supportive of European growth, and that means that we're still on track for stronger and more balanced global growth, which is positive for the Asian economies and their own exports.
Joanne Masters, currency strategist with Macquarie Bank. Thank you very much for your thoughts. Up next on Stock Watch, acquisitions talk driving the blue chips. General Motors' bid to buy a stake in Japan's Fuji Heavy Industries sends the stock on the up and up. On Stock Watch, acquisition talk dominating the news. Look for another day of gains for Japan's Fuji Heavy Industries, which is the maker of Subaru cars. Its shares surged in London overnight on reports that General Motors will buy a 20 to 25% stake in the company. Fuji Heavy finished up 139 from its Tokyo close. In Tokyo trade, it gained 13%. Hong Kong's Hutchison Whampoa is poised for further gains after confirming a deal with Japan's NTT Docomo. After the market closed, Hutchison said NTT Docomo would buy a 19% stake in its mobile phone unit for $410 million US. Hutchison's stock rose more than 3.5% to a new record high in anticipation of the news. What looks like a breakthrough at the World Trade Talks in Seattle is developing. Reuters reports that the U.S. and the European Union have come to an agreement on agriculture, one of the toughest negotiating points. Reuters says the two sides have agreed to work toward the elimination of farm export subsidies. Up until now, the EU had resisted demands to abolish tariffs. For an update, we are joined on the line from Seattle by Philippine Trade Secretary Jose Pardo. Secretary Pardo, thank you very much for joining us. First of all, this new breakthrough, tell us how significant this is and how you think Asian economies are going to benefit from this.
This has always been a contentious issue. It's a move in the right direction. The fact that subsidies, both for exports and domestic subsidies in agriculture, was a minimum position demanded by developing economies, and apparently they're now prepared to talk, which hopefully will now look at the mutuality of interest between both groups.
How do you see this? Go ahead. Continue.
Yes. But the problem remains that there are, well, the labor and environmental dimension now being thrown in to trade agreements, and that it could be used as sanctions to enforce them by the WTO. This has opened a new totally a new aspect to negotiations, and why we still have we're at a standstill, because the position of most developing countries is to limit the new round of talks to the agenda items without throwing in issues of labor and environmental, biotechnology, and other concerns.
Okay.
Civil society empowerment. We feel that it will probably divert our attention, and instead we wanted focus on the general agreement on trade and services that has not been implemented as of yet, and this issue of agriculture and the facilitation of trade globally.
Secretary, how about this deal, though, this farm deal? How much is that going to boost the trade with the Philippines and other Asian economies, do you think, very briefly?
Well, in the case of the Philippines, of course, it would open markets that perhaps we could not access, and with the WTO now putting in China, there will be the added benefit for ASEAN countries to look at the opportunities to grow trade with China. So agriculture being very crucial and critical to developing economies like the Philippines.
Secretary, there are reports that the ministers are making some progress on the anti-dumping laws, which Japan and others view as a form of U.S. protectionism. What's the latest on that, very briefly?
Well, I did make it a point to question why, up to now, no implementing rules had been put together on dumping and the safeguard measures that we feel at the very minimum should be looked at. We have what we call the like-minded group countries, and we were saying that we should clarify existing rules that affect anti-dumping in order to correct shortcomings in such rules as we have been experiencing in the last 5 years. Because as we liberalize, more and more dumping cases have been occurring, and in the case of the Philippines, we've strengthened our anti-dumping group to be able to respond to demands of sectors that feel they have been injured.
All right. Secretary Pardo, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much, the Philippine Secretary of Trade and Industry. Most people do it, but no one will admit it. The truth is, though, so many people use their work computers to go shopping online that retailers are starting to cotton on. We'll tell you more in our weekly Time Out feature. Breaking away from the daily routine for some holiday shopping online might turn out to be a temptation that's as close as your mouse. Bruce Francis reports in our Friday Time Out feature.
It's the dirty little secret of the web. When consumers shop, they usually aren't at home. They're at work, but clearly not working.
There's also the sort of lunch hour and after hours phenomena. And many times people will use their PCs at work where they have faster bandwidth. Higher bandwidth and faster connectivity so that they can go and shop quicker.
Many top commerce sites like On Sale, MarthaStewart.com, Computer Dealer Insight, and giant Amazon.com find that people spend more time shopping from work, shown in red, than at home in yellow.
About 60% of the buying happens during the, quote, 9 to 5, and the rest of the 40% happens after hours. But, you know, the marketeers and people realize that this is one of the best ways to reach consumers in a transaction environment during a time when, historically, before the web at large, they couldn't reach these people.
If that's true, some consumers don't like to admit it.
Maybe during lunchtime I close the door and do a little bit.
No. Why not? We have a policy about using personal use of computers in the businesses, so we don't do that. But I do a browse every now and then, typically after hours.
I do it usually on early morning before anybody comes in, or lunchtime. I rarely do it lunchtime, early morning. No trouble.
Online retailers like JewelerAshford.com applaud the trend and even fess up.
I work at home and I work at work and I shop at home and I shop at work, so I think there's definitely a blurring of the lines.
Right now, companies don't appear too eager to enforce policies that forbid personal use of personal computers. But it is an easy matter to block access to shopping sites. Much easier, for example, than trying to prevent personal phone calls. Bruce Francis, CNN Financial News, New York.
Recapping the overnight action on Wall Street, in the New York currency markets, the euro has hit parity with the U.S. dollar. While on the street, blue chips added 40 points to close at 11,039. Tech stocks higher as well, the Nasdaq soaring 99 points to 3452. Its fourth biggest point gain ever. We'll have more business news in 15 minutes. Now to Karuna and CNN This Morning.
Well, Farland, WTO protests are starting to heat up again, and the sun falls on a day that'll stand out in future histories of Northern Ireland. It's next on CNN This Morning. Good morning. I'm Karuna Shinsho in Hong Kong, and here are the headlines. An explosion at an apartment building in assistance from Jakarta to help rebuild the territory. Well, Russian President Boris Yeltsin is said to be in satisfactory condition after being admitted to the hospital. Fears about the president's latest illness. Mr. Yeltsin has been in and out of the hospital several times with heart problems and pneumonia over the past 4 years. And those are the world headlines. Be back in about 15 minutes, Farland.
Thanks very much, Karuna. China's economy continues to make the right moves. Figures out earlier this week show producer prices, that's the price being charged by factories for their products, rising for the first time in 25 months. That coincides with more evidence that Chinese consumers are starting to spend again. For more on that, we're joined by our financial editor, Andrew Stevens, fresh back from vacation.
Fresh indeed.
Good to see you, Andrew. Now, those producer prices did rise, but it was only a tiny amount, with 0.04%. What can be read into that?
Yeah, it's hardly bell-ringing stuff, isn't it? But if you're an economist, Farland, it obviously is quite exciting. 0.04% is a very small number, but if you take that in context, this is the first time in 25 months, as you say, the actual producer prices have been positive. Now, the bigger picture there, of course, is if this is a continuing trend, and there's evidence to suggest, which I'll tell you about in a minute, that this will continue, it's showing that factories are now feeling more confident about putting up prices, which could change a mindset in the Chinese consumer's mind that they should be actually out there buying now. Because what's been happening, we've had a deflationary spiral in China. People have been putting off their purchases because they think that prices will get cheaper in the longer run, which they have been doing. Now, if that starts turning around, you may start seeing some consumer spending. And what we have seen, that 0.04% is a year-on-year figure. But if you look at month-on-month, for the past 3 months, the numbers have been positive. So there is some straws in the wind there, but it's certainly not radical, but for an economist, it's pretty exciting stuff.
Well, the cutting edge for the Chinese economy is consumer spending. Any sign of life there, then?
Well, the Financial News, which is the central bank's own newspaper, was out yesterday talking about consumer spending actually rising in October, again up 8.5%, which is, again, that's actually quite a healthy number. That's the second month in a row that we've seen consumer spending up. At the moment, it's targeted in fairly narrow areas. We're looking at spending going up in tourism, in restaurants, in railway travel, things like that. So it's broad, it's a narrow thing at the moment, but again, what this could be pointing to is there is a feel-good factor starting to come in. People are going out to eat, which is usually quite a strong indicator that they're feeling better about themselves and about spending money. So you must remember too, put this in the context that the government has been trying to get people to spend money really for the past 2 years. They've cut interest rates 7 times since '96. They put a tax on interest, on savings, and bank accounts. They're doing everything. They're talking up the stock markets. So we're actually looking like there is some sort of consumer spending revival going on.
What's the big picture for the Chinese economy? The government says next year we should have some stronger growth. Is that being supported?
Yeah, Trade Minister Xi Guangsheng says that 7.6% next year. That's against a target of around about 7.2% this year, which should be met. Independent economists tend to support those numbers. In fact, Paribas, which is the local branch of Paribas here, talking about 10% growth in 2001, 7.6% next year. So obviously looking pretty pretty good. Just quickly, 10% would make it probably the strongest growth in the world.
Would be impressive. Thanks very much.
Especially for China.
Yeah, Andrew Stevens, our financial editor. Coming up, we will talk to a trade expert about today's street protests in Seattle, which we now know have indeed canceled the opening ceremonies, and the prospects for a new round of world trade talks.
Chevron is proud to be
In Seattle, protesters have succeeded in delaying, if not shutting down, World Trade Organization meetings. The latest word is that the opening ceremonies have been canceled. For a closer look at the issues, I'm joined by Gary Huffbauer at the Institute for International Economics. He joins us live from our bureau in Washington, D.C. Mr. Huffbauer, thanks very much for joining us. Now, the protesters say the WTO favors rich countries and neglects labor and environmental concerns. Now that they've stolen the headlines, are the talks in jeopardy?
No, I don't think the talks are in jeopardy, but the protesters won the first round. However, these talks go on for the whole week, and I'm expecting a launch of 3 years of negotiations.
Some developing countries don't even want another round of trade talks. How is that going to affect the talks?
Well, this is really just a negotiating ploy on the part of countries such as India, which at the top reaches want talks, but they certainly want the U.S. and the Europeans to put real meat on the table, real concessions, and so they're holding back, but it's no more than holding back. It's no more than preliminary negotiating tactics.
Well, if the developing countries are holding back, could it also be argued that the developed countries are doing the same? I mean, the World Bank's chief economist, Joseph Stiglitz, says the rich nations have been hypocritical by failing to offer the poorer economies the same openness that they demanded from them. Is that fair?
Well, I think that's a little bit strong, but it is true that the rich countries, let's say especially Japan and the United States, are not willing to put major concessions on the table at this early stage. The United States isn't willing to talk about cutting its textile tariffs. Japan isn't willing to talk about opening its agricultural markets, rice, meat, all the rest of it. So everybody's holding back amongst the official negotiators, and meanwhile the protesters are stealing the thunder, as you said.
Very briefly, down the road, do you think the U.S. will make progress in getting the EU and Japan to cut their agricultural subsidies?
Yes, it will, but again, that's sort of 3 or 4 years away, even 5 years away, and right now, no EU minister can talk about cutting agricultural subsidies and go home and expect to have a job.
And how about Japan? Is it going to get anywhere in trying to change U.S. anti-dumping laws?
Well, certainly not this year, and certainly not in this launch, but again, these are going to be talks that go on for 2, 3, 4 years, and at the end of the day, I really think the U.S. will put anti-dumping on the table because there are other things the U.S. wants to get, and if it doesn't give, it won't get.
Gary Huffbauer, Institute for International Economics, appreciate your sharing your thoughts on our show.
Thanks a lot.
Getting married gets even easier thanks to the internet. Now there's an easier way to register your wedding gifts, and we'll tell you how. That's on today's Your Money feature next.
Center of the tech world.
Saturday on CNN.
This is CNN.
And for Asia Business Morning is Farland Chang. Farland.
Thanks very much, Karuna. Good morning, everybody. In this half hour of Asia Business Morning, U.S. stocks finished down as investors cash in on their massive tech gains. 2 days of Japanese central bank intervention, but the stubborn yen barely budges from its highs. And in Malaysia, post-election euphoria fizzles out as investors sober up to the new political order. Asia Business Morning is next. Good morning and welcome to Asia Business Morning. I'm Farland Chang. U.S. tech stocks face a sell-down. Investors cashing in gains from their stunning run-up in the past weeks. Beverly Shook wraps up the market action from New York.
Stocks suffered broad-based losses and volatile trading on Wall Street. Profit-taking and caution ahead of Friday's employment numbers largely to blame. The Dow Jones Industrial Average down 70 points to 10,877. AT&T, the biggest loser, giving up some of its recent gains. It fell $4 a share. GE and General Motors among the other two notable losers, shedding $3 and $2.50 respectively. The Nasdaq Composite took an even bigger hit, tumbling 85 points, about 2.5%. Still, the Nasdaq is up 15.5% for November. The S&P 500 gave up 18 points. In the U.S. bond market, the 30-year Treasury gaining 7 ticks in price, pushing the yield down to 6.28%. And on the economic front, consumer confidence rose in November, marking the first increase in 4 months. The report could be a sign of good things to come this holiday season. U.S. regulators give the final green light to the ExxonMobil merger. The $81 billion deal creates the biggest non-government petroleum company in the world. It also reunites two of the biggest parts of J.D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil monopoly, broken up back in 1911. The approval still requires the oil giants to sell 2,400 gas stations, as well as some other assets, during the next 12 months. And that is a look at financial news in New York. I'm Beverly Shook.
Now for an in-depth look at Wall Street's sell-down overnight, I'm joined by Sam Maxwell, Vice President and Investment Officer at Dane Rauscher in Seattle. Well, Sam, Seattle, of course, the scene of all those protests over the WTO meeting. Was your business, or were you affected at all by what's going on there?
A lot of action today, Farland. Actually, no, I was in the office all morning, and I heard some noise, and I looked up out the window a couple times, and I saw some people marching on, down the street, but it didn't really affect me at all. But most of the businesses downtown either aren't going to work today or are leaving early. I left the office today at 2 o'clock, and it's disrupted the bus service somewhat, but it's not as bad as you might think by watching the television.
Okay, what about the markets? Have you noticed any impact at all from all these protests on the market?
Oh, I don't think so. I don't think that's affected the market at all. Although I did see one interesting thing this morning that 95% of the world's consumers live outside the U.S., so I think it probably is a pretty important meeting, or at least the starting of one.
Okay, good to get your thoughts. I'm glad you're safe at home now. Turning to the tech sell-off on Wall Street, do you see this as the start of a bigger correction?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, you keep in mind that technology stocks have really led the market the last few years, and just in the last month alone, the Nasdaq Composite, which is where many of the big name technology stocks are, up 14%, and the last year we're up 70%. So these stocks have had a fantastic run-up, and I think some profit taking is normal.
Do you think it's a time to buy on weakness, or perhaps wait a little longer?
I still think that we might have more of a correction before the end of the year with the Y2K coming up. So I think if I was somebody that had some cash on the sidelines, I might wait a bit longer. And if you're someone who's a long-term investor that's already in the market, I certainly wouldn't sell here.
Apple Computer defied the tech sell-off that reached an all-time high. What do you think about that stock?
Well, that's been a really fantastic story. If only we had bought it 2 years ago when it was at $12. But they had a good analyst report, a couple upgrades, increasing their earnings estimates for the next quarter. And keep in mind, this last quarter with the Christmas season here in the U.S. Is the big season for computer sales. So they were up about $3 on the day.
Yeah, it's you said $12, and then it closed what? At a little more than 100 or something. What was it?
It was up. It was up over 103 at one point during the day.
Hey, what's your outlook on Asian stocks? Do you think it's a good time to diversify the portfolio into this area?
Well, I've always maintained that you should have some money there, and I definitely was going against the grain last year when nobody wanted to put any money into Asia, and that market has really taken off in the last 12 months. But sure, I think if you're someone that believes in asset allocation and not putting all your money into one market sector, I think you should also not put all your money into one country. And I think having some money outside the U.S. with a good chunk in Asia definitely makes sense.
Okay, Sam Maxwell, Vice President, Dane Rauscher, safe in Seattle. Thanks very much for that.
Okay.
The defiant yen is holding firm after a second day of central bank selling. It's currently hovering around 102 to the dollar after revisiting a near 4-year high of 101.30 on Tuesday. Traders spotted the Bank of Japan buying both dollars and euro for yen in late Asian trade. They estimate it spent $3 to $5 billion. Meanwhile, market talk has it that a top Japanese official is heading to Washington to discuss joint currency intervention. Japanese authorities declined comment on the speculation. The strong yen sent Japanese stocks sharply lower. The Nikkei down more than 1.5% on fears the yen's strength will eat into corporate profits. Well, the yen's rise also having an impact on other Asian currencies. With more on that, our financial editor, Andrew Stevens. Andrew, what about these currencies? Just how much pressure are they under?
Well, there've been a sell-off pretty much across the board in Asia and the Asian currencies over the past couple of days. A couple of notable exceptions. First on that is the Korean won, which has been reacting very much to strong economic numbers and a lot of foreign fund inflows there. So the won stronger. Also the new Taiwan dollar, which has actually been following the yen up, Farland. But for the rest of them, there has been a sell-off. What's underlying this sell-off is that businesses are buying dollars because they're seeing the dollar weakening, so they want to lock in some strong dollars because they got dollar loans. They got dollar-denominated loans. They want to get dollars so they can pay them off. And while the strength of the yen continues, this is likely to continue as well. Obviously, they're not going to keep buy any more than they have to, but there certainly still has been a lot of buying going on, and analysts say that should continue. Interesting what you're saying about that Japanese delegation going to Washington or New York, I should say, to look at whether there's a concerted intervention. Obviously, that would be much more successful than just a Bank of Japan intervention on its own. So you may see the dollar come off quite sharply. So there could be some more buying of dollars today, on the Asian currencies being hit again.
Any concern that there could be a sharp sell-off in Asian currencies?
Well, it's probably been more the opposite, actually. Asian governments have been very worried about their currencies appreciating and taking the edge off their competitiveness. Now, if you look at what's happened to Asian currencies since the start of the crisis in July, they're still way, way under the levels they were 2 years ago. Just a couple of numbers there. If you look at the rupiah, it's down still 68, 67%. The baht's 33% down. The Sing dollar's 15. The Korean won is down 27%. That's on those levels a year ago. And that obviously is helping their recovery. The export story is very strong. And the Korea, for instance, has been actively selling off the won, just trying to keep its level down. So the problems, if you like, is more on the upside than the downside of the currencies, because there's no inflation in the systems around Asia at the moment, so people don't have to worry about a weak currency importing inflation. That story may happen in a year or so's time, but at the moment, no.
All right, well, we'll be having analysts later on in the show talking about the inflation picture as well as the Japanese yen picture. Thanks very much, Andrew Stevens, financial editor. Korean stocks charging ahead. The Korean Composite Index jumping more than 3% Tuesday.